All right. So welcome to MOD's Closer Look at Title II. As I said, I'm Julia O'Leary. I'm the General Counsel here at Massachusetts Office on Disability. For quick visual description, I am a young-ish woman with blonde-ish hair. I'm white. I'm wearing a black sweater. And we are going to take a look today at Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So first, we're going to kind of cover basic Title II requirements that everybody needs to take into consideration. Then we're going to talk about program access and what that means under Title II of the ADA, different means of achieving program access. Next, we're going to talk about reasonable modifications, and we're going to go through what the process is for reviewing and approving a reasonable modification under Title II. It's slightly different from what you're going to do under Title I for an employee because you have a slightly different relationship. And then we're going to go through my favorite resources, as always. And I'm going to ask to hold questions till the end. We do have some examples we're going to go through around program access and reasonable modifications, so we can get a little audience participation then. So our basic Title II requirements is where we're going to start. Here we've got a picture of George Bush I signing the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. You see him signing at a table. There's some folks standing around and behind him. Some of them are in wheelchairs, and there is you can almost see the Capitol in the background. So Title II of the ADA provides that no qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of such disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities of a public entity, or be subjected to discrimination by any such entity. So it's a lot of words. It basically means we as public entities need to make sure that our services, programs, and activities are accessible to people with disabilities, and that we do not discriminate against people with disabilities in how we administer the work that we do. So some basic requirements that sort of allow us as public entities to carry out that requirement. Every public entity, and the public entity is a state agency, it's a municipality, county level government. Every public entity needs to assign an ADA coordinator. We often think of ADA coordinators in the employment context. We also need to make sure that there is a single point of contact or an ADA coordinator who is responsible for complying with Title II. Sometimes that's going to be the same person as the person that handles employment requests, and sometimes it's going to be a different person. If it is a different person, make sure that Mass Office on Disability knows who you've assigned for that task. You can reach out to me directly, and we need to know and be able to track that. You also need to post a non-discrimination statement in all agency facilities and on your agency website that includes contact information for your ADA coordinator. This can be a really simple statement. Ours is pretty short. It basically says, our agency doesn't discriminate on the basis of disability. If you need a reasonable accommodation or modification, please contact our ADA coordinator, and then it provides my name and contact information. So this is a really simple statement, but you do need to make sure that it's available in your facilities, posted in a place where members of the public are going to see it, and you want to have it on your website. A great place to put that on your website is the About page. You also want to have a procedure for responding to requests for reasonable modifications. And we're going to talk about sort of the workflow that you will do for reasonable modifications, but it's important that you have internally documented some sort of procedure that says, how are you going to receive these requests? How are you going to make sure that agency supervisors and managers know that, and other staff know that these requests need to come to you as the ADA coordinator? And how are you going to track them and process them? It's also required by Title II that you establish and publish a grievance procedure to respond to complaints regarding requests for reasonable modifications or other access-related complaints. Typically, what this grievance procedure is going to look like in the executive branch is that you will have these decisions appealed to the secretariat level. And then if the person is unsatisfied at the secretariat level, they would appeal to Mass Office on Disability. There is an example of a grievance procedure in the appendices to our executive branch ADA handbook. So that's linked on the resources slide. And I think most of you have a copy of that already. It's also on our website. Make sure that that grievance procedure is known and available to the public so that people know how to make a complaint or how to appeal the denial of a reasonable modification request. Agencies also needed to complete a self-evaluation and transition plan. Excuse me. Most executive branch agencies in Massachusetts probably completed one in the 90s, hopefully completed one in the 90s. So if you're an ADA coordinator for your agency, take a look at that self-evaluation and transition plan. See how you might want to be updating it and consider whether it needs an update, whether it needs a refresh, because that's really your guide to how you as an agency are going to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, both by identifying where you're falling short and then in the transition plan, identifying how you're going to remedy those issues. And that can be a really helpful tool as an ADA coordinator to kind of empower you to have a plan for improving the accessibility of your agency's programs and services. So other Title II requirements, this is a long list. Title II entities cannot deny access to services, programs, or activities based on disability. You cannot deny, there's a typo there. You must provide services, programs, activities in the most integrated setting appropriate to the needs of qualified people with disabilities. So you cannot provide one track for people with disabilities and one track for people without disabilities unless it is the absolute last resort to provide meaningful access to those people with disabilities. So you should, as a default, provide your services in an integrated setting where you're making accommodations for people with disabilities as needed and structuring your services, your programs in a way that's accessible from the get-go. You can't place a surcharge on people with disabilities for the cost of making modifications to your programs or services. You can't have a surcharge for someone bringing a service animal along. You can't have a surcharge for someone who requests a sign language interpreter or a CART reporter, for example. You need to integrate that in, excuse me, to your agency budget. You also can't exclude people with disabilities or people associated with people with disabilities from your services or programs. You need to make sure that site facilities are in locations that are accessible to people with disabilities. So if you're opening up a new office, we'll talk about this later, make sure that that office is accessible. And make sure that any licensing programs that your agency administers does not discriminate against people with disabilities. So that's the overview, and we're going to take a deep dive into what program access means. This is a big buzzword in Title II, and it basically means that you, as a public entity, need to ensure that people with disabilities can access your public programs. And that needs to be done proactively and not just reactively. So what is program access? Public entities must ensure that your program as a whole is accessible to people with disabilities. So you need to kind of look at every aspect of the programs and the services you provide and think about whether they are accessible to people with disabilities, whether there are barriers to access that you need to address, and whether you need to sort of make programmatic changes in order to make those programs more accessible to people with disabilities. Part of program access, and I think the most literal part of program access, is physical access, making sure that members of the public can get in the door. You need to make sure that the facilities that you're operating that are open to the public are accessible to people with disabilities. And this can be achieved in a variety of ways. It in part means compliance with applicable architectural access guidelines. So that could be either the US Access Code or the Massachusetts Architectural Access Code. Make sure that you have a plan for remediating any areas that aren't accessible. So if you know that your facility's elevator breaks constantly, come up with a plan for how you're going to make sure that that doesn't have a long-term impact on the ability of people with disabilities to access your facility. If you need help understanding the architectural access guidelines, Mass Office on Disability is a great resource for that. We can even do a site visit if that's appropriate. So definitely reach out to us as a resource. We're here to kind of help you, guide you around what the requirements are around architectural access. It's also really important, and we don't always think of this when we think of physical accessibility, but make sure that your facility has both appropriate and accessible signage, including signage to help people with disabilities find any available accessibility type services. So when I talk about appropriate and accessible signage, when you're developing the signage, it should be high contrast, it should be large font, it should be raised or include Braille, preferably have it be raised so that it's accessible to people with vision-related disabilities, and make sure it's displayed prominently, that it has sufficient information for people to navigate your facilities. And if you offer accessibility services, for example, if you have an ASL interpreter on staff, make sure that you have signage that indicates that and tells people where to find that service so that they can avail themselves of that service. Because if you have an ASL interpreter on staff that's able to work with members of the public, but there's no sort of signpost telling people this is where to find that person, you're not doing a great job at providing that communication access, because they need to be able to find the interpreter in order to be able to use them. So think through what kind of services you are already proactively providing to people that they might need help accessing. Same goes for, directions to an accessible bathroom or directions to accessible parking on the premises. So you want to make sure that your public areas have accessible bathrooms, have accessible parking that is nearby to the facility and easy to access, and has clear accessible routes to the building. When we're thinking about program access, we also need to talk about communication access, which we talked a little bit about on the last slide. But you need to make sure that your agency is effectively communicating with all constituents. And this means different things for different people with different disabilities. You need to be proactive in providing communication access at events. We at MOD have a policy of booking both American Sign Language interpreters and CART reporters for every event. And CART, for those who aren't familiar with it, is real-time captioning. So we have a human being on our Zoom webinar today who is typing captions into the closed captioning at the bottom of the screen, if you turned that on. And that is much more effective communication access than relying on auto captioning. So proactively provide communication access at events. Make sure that you've booked those services so that if people need them, they're available. You can always cancel them if you don't get requests, but it's much easier to cancel after you've booked them than it is to book someone at the last minute. And that booking can go through Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. If you go to their website, it's very easy to book communication access resources there. It's also very important that you provide clear instructions for how members of the public can request communication or auxiliary aids and services or other accommodations that assist with communication. So what might this look like? It might be that someone needs an ASL interpreter. It might mean that someone needs to receive printed materials that will be provided at a meeting in advance digitally so that they can review them on their computer with their screen reader instead of having to read a form in person if they have a visual impairment. It might mean that they need a reader to read paperwork or other documentation to them during a meeting or during an event. It might mean that you need to use plain language in your materials so that people are able to effectively understand the message that you're trying to convey or the information that you're trying to gather. Another really important part of communication with the public these days is making sure that our public websites allow equal access to people with disabilities. This is becoming a sort of increasingly interesting topic to the Department of Justice. We're seeing a rise in the number of complaints that they're filing against public entities for inaccessible web offerings, including websites or kind of web-based programs. So it's something that we need to pay attention to. They've also more recently issued some guidance on web accessibility that gives us kind of a look at what they might be looking for here. So the bottom line is that if you comply with our Commonwealth's accessibility policy, you will be in good shape, because we have EOTS has an excellent accessibility policy that governs sort of the accessibility standards for the information technology that we manage as a Commonwealth. That policy adopts WCAG 2.1, which is one of the different accessibility standards that's out there. So if you are if you're in compliance with our state policy that already exists, you should be in good shape. But web accessibility isn't a static thing, so it's something that you need to keep working on. One way to make sure that you are maintaining that you have web accessibility in the first place and that you are able to maintain it is to include accessibility requirements in your procurement process. We have worked with EOTS and other state agencies to provide procurement guidance that's now up on EOTS's website, which is linked in the resources page. So as an ADA coordinator, as another person who works on accessibility for your agency, make sure that your procurement teams are aware that that guidance exists and that they're using it when they are putting together a procurement for an IT product. You also need to make sure that you're testing your websites and web-based programs for accessibility prior to launch and after any updates. So as I said, accessibility isn't static. What accessibility means, or and how accessible a program is going to be it's going to change, because you're going to have updates either to someone's accessibility software or to your own software that might render a previously accessible website or web-based program inaccessible. So make sure that you're testing throughout the life cycle of the product or the website, and definitely before you launch any updates or before you take the initial launch, obviously. You can either do this in-house, so make sure that if you have in-house development staff, that they know how to do that, or you can hire a vendor. There is a statewide contract called ITS 61 that you can use to do that testing. If the testing identifies an accessibility barrier that you're not able to fix prior to the launch, consider establishing a mitigation plan. A mitigation plan is what it sounds like. It's a workaround strategy that the agency will use to make sure that people with disabilities are able to access whatever content or program they need to on that website or web-based program, despite the accessibility barrier that you're unable to fix at the time. And the plan should also include sort of a plan for how you're going to eventually correct that problem and make the website accessible. But that's a really important process here, because at the end of the day, you need these websites and these web-based programs to be accessible. And so if they're not, you need a workaround, and that's what a mitigation plan is for. Also, one thing that sometimes we overlook is we'll post documents on our websites and forget that while our website is accessible in the HTML format, the documents that are downloadable from our website are not accessible. So, do a check of that and make sure that the content that you're allowing people to download is also accessible. I mean, if you have questions about web accessibility, your obligations, how to achieve it, if you want someone to take a quick look at your website, please feel free to reach out to Mass Office on Disability. We are here to help you with that. So you're not sort of on your own here. We have support for you. Other considerations for program access. Public entities should consider the needs of people with disabilities when they are developing their program. So if you guys are launching a new program in your agency, folks should be consulting with their Title II ADA coordinator to think about the different ways that people with disabilities might need to access that program and what their sort of needs might be, and how to make that program more accessible to people with disabilities. As you're developing eligibility criteria for your programs or services, make sure that you're not including unnecessary eligibility criteria. So an example might be a driver's license. Does the person applying for this program need a driver's license because they're required to drive, or is the driver's license being used as a shortcut for identification or ability to travel from one place to another? You need to make sure that your agency staff knows that they need to allow service animals in agency facilities where appropriate, and we'll cover that in one of the examples. You need to make sure that you're permitting mobility devices in areas that are open to public use. So you can't sort of prohibit motorized mobility devices in your facility if members of the public who are pedestrians can access those areas. You also want to put your ADA coordinator's contact information on any communication or paperwork that invites the public to use the entity's programs, services, or activities. So the ADA coordinator's contact information really needs to be out there in public so that people know how to request a reasonable modification or how to ask about accessibility for any opportunity that they have to interact with your agency. So that means that if you have public meeting notices, make sure that those include your ADA coordinator's contact information. If you have a program or a service application that people fill out, include the ADA coordinator's contact information on that application paperwork so that people know how to ask for an accommodation if they need one to use the program or service. And one question that comes up sometimes is, should we just include a box on our form for our application form for this program or this service that asks what accommodations somebody needs? My general answer to that question would be no. You want to keep the request for a reasonable modification separate from the person's application for a service, because that introduces the possibility of discrimination on the basis of disability, right? So you want those two to proceed on parallel tracks and not be blended in one application. And someone's eligibility for a program or service should be completely independent from their need for a reasonable accommodation and whether that reasonable accommodation is appropriate and something that the agency can provide. So my best practice rule would be put that ADA coordinator's contact information on the application form instead of inviting people to request the accommodation on the application itself. So I have a couple of examples to help us kind of put these ideas into practice. Excuse me. So in our first example, an agency is preparing to host a public hearing. And I kind of want to talk about some different things that an agency should be considering when when it's undertaking these kind of plans. So a couple of the basic ones are to choose a venue that is physically accessible. I wish that this went without saying, but it doesn't. You actually need to look at the venue that you're providing and make sure that it is accessible to people with disabilities. So is the room that the meeting is going to happen in on the first floor, or do you need to access it by stairs? Are there stairs up to the building where the public hearing will be held? If there are, do you have a lift or some way for someone who has mobility disability to get into the building? Is there accessible parking at the building? Are there accessible restrooms that are convenient to the room where the public hearing will be held? Are the hallways wide enough to navigate in a wheelchair or with a mobility device? Is the meeting room navigable with those mobility devices? Have you set up the room in a way that people who have wheelchairs or other mobility devices can pull up easily into a seat? So you're going to want to have some spaces that are clear so that someone with a wheelchair can use that space. You're also going to want to think about what communication access you're going to be providing. And if you're going to provide, say, a sign language interpreter, see how the sight lines are in the room to make sure that you're choosing the right spot for your interpreter, and consider, if you know that there are people who need to use that sign language interpreter, consider reserving some seats for those folks so that they have a clear line of sight. Same goes for cart services. Think about how you want to present the transcript. Are you going to broadcast it on a screen? That can be a really effective way. Sometimes that doesn't work for whatever venue that you're in, and you're going to need to provide that on an individual monitor or tablet instead. And you can work with the interpreters, the cart provider that you've hired to kind of troubleshoot some of that, because they're really experts. MCDHH can also give you guidance about how to set up that event appropriately. And like I always say, make sure that your ADA coordinator's contact information is on that meeting notice. Does anybody else have ideas about how to make a public hearing accessible to people with disabilities? You want to raise your hand, I can call on folks. People are shy this afternoon. I gotcha. All right. So a couple other things that you want to consider is, make sure that if you're presenting visual material, you're providing verbal descriptions of that material. So if you have a picture that is relevant to what you're talking about, or if you have a map or a chart, make sure that you're that the people who are putting on the public hearing are visually describing that. If you're showing, footage in a video recording, make sure that that's that you've provided audio description to that. Try to use plain language as much as possible, and be open to feedback from members of the community about what they might need to access that public hearing. All right, so my second example is an agency is reviewing its internal policies and procedures. What are some things that they should keep in mind? Well, first they should check and see if they have a grievance procedure for Title II, because that's required by the ADA. And if you don't have one, when you're doing kind of a bulk review of your internal policies and procedures, which sometimes happens when we have an administration change, make sure that you're checking to see if you have a grievance procedure. And if you don't, take a look at our sample in the disability handbook, and make that fit for your agency. And then as you're reviewing your internal policies and procedures, think about how your policies or your procedures might unintentionally exclude people with disabilities. Massachusetts is, we have the best of intentions here in state government, but sometimes the way that we've structured our policies or our procedures of how we carry out our programs unintentionally excludes people with disabilities. And the more thoughtful we are about that, the better we can be at providing program access. So think about what eligibility criteria exists currently, how that might affect people with disabilities. Think about what types of ways members of the public are interacting with your agency and how to sort of reduce the barriers in those interactions. I know this is kind of high level, but we're going to get more specific when we talk about specific modification requests. This is really in your policy development stage, your brainstorming stage. You want to be thinking always about access for people with disabilities, and you want to make sure that your program staff are including the Title II ADA coordinator in these policy development meetings, in the projects, because the Title II coordinator needs to be able to give guidance to the agency around its obligations to be accessible to people with disabilities. So make sure that the Title II coordinator is included and at the table for internal policy and procedure reviews. Example 3, agency is updating its website. As I said before, and this is a passion of mine, make sure that your agency is considering accessibility in the procurement process from the very beginning of the process. So as your team is developing its business requirements or its scope of work for the project, make sure that accessibility is incorporated at that level. So from the very beginning, when you're thinking about what kind of product are we looking for, make sure that you're thinking about accessibility. Think about how users are going to use that product and how to sort of incorporate accessibility principles from the beginning. And MOD is always here to kind of help you brainstorm that. Once you put the product, the project out to bid, make sure that that bid document has requirements that the product meet our accessibility standards. Make sure that it includes the mandatory contract language that EATS has around IT accessibility, and make sure that you're thinking about how testing is going to work, accessibility testing is going to work prior to launch, and as updates might be necessary on the website. Also think about, what your vendor's experience with accessibility is, because it really varies. One of the things that EATS offers on its website is a list of questions that you might want to ask vendors about accessibility and the accessibility of their product, and their team's approach to accessibility. And that's going to give you really good qualitative evidence about how mature a company or vendor is with respect to IT accessibility. All right. You want to make sure that you're testing websites prior to launch, and work with work with your development team or your vendor to make sure that everything is being tested for accessibility before it's made available to the public. If you have kind of a quick and dirty project that you need someone to take a look at from accessibility perspective, feel free to reach out to MOD. We do that for free. If it's more in depth, you might want to hire a vendor off of ITS 61, which is one of the statewide contracts. But make sure that you have a plan for testing. And if you need technical assistance at any stage, if you need technical assistance at any stage, please reach out to MOD. We can take a look at what you've got right now. We can take a look at the specs of what you're looking to get and give you feedback on sort of how things are looking. Now we are going to talk about reasonable modifications, which is, any change that you're going to make as a public entity to how you're providing your programs, services, or activities. You want to make sure that you have a procedure for tracking and responding to these requests, as I mentioned at the beginning, because that's going to help you as an agency comply with them. Part of this is making sure that your staff is trained that if a reasonable modification request comes in from a member of the public, it needs to be handled by someone who's trained as a Title II ADA coordinator and not just sort of by front-end staff on randomly. You need to sort of treat this as a professional part of your agency's services. And make sure you have a grievance procedure if you don't. I'll say that until I'm blue in my face. So what does the process look like for navigating a reasonable modification request? We've got some ADA coordinators on here that I know are really familiar with the employee side of the process. This public side is pretty similar, but there are some differences. So we're going to kind of go through it. And then on the next slide, we're going to talk about some of those differences. When you get a request for reasonable modification from a member of the public, first you're going to have that conversation with the requester. You're going to go through the interactive process. You're going to determine whether this need is disability based. Does the person need this change because of their disability, or are they a person with a disability who's asking for a change that doesn't have anything to do with their disability? If it's the latter, if the change that they're asking for doesn't actually have to do with their disability, it's not actually a reasonable modification request under Title II. So you don't need to address it in that way. If it is because of a disability that they need this change, you're going to ask how their disability-based limitation affects their ability to access the public service, program, or activity. This is really similar to what we see in the employment context, right? So the focus always is on that disability-based limitation and how it's creating a barrier to access to the public service. And kind of having a conversation with the person can really help draw out the nuance there of where are things breaking down that you're not able to access the service. Then you're going to think about whether the accommodation is reasonable. Now, if the accommodation is reasonable, and I think I say this on the next slide, but if you get a request for CART services or ASL services for a public event, just grant it. You don't need to have this conversation. You can just say, sure, we will book those services and have it be done. You don't need to have a conversation about their need or their disability-based limitation where it's really obvious, and just approve it if it's reasonable on its face. If it's more complex, you're going to consider the feasibility of the request. There are a couple of reasons that you could deny a reasonable accommodation request if it's going to create a financial or administrative burden, although for those of you who have been to my other trainings, you know that it's pretty hard to establish an undue financial burden if you're a public entity, because courts are going to look at the state budget as a whole, not the budget of your individual program or your agency, but like a whole state budget for that fiscal year. So it's pretty hard to say that you're going to face a financial burden in light of the entire fiscal budget for that year. You're also going to, think about whether it creates an administrative burden. An administrative burden is when our request just isn't workable. It would be so much work to implement it that it's not really feasible. You also can deny an accommodation if it would fundamentally alter the nature of the service, or if it would pose a direct threat to other members of the public or to agency staff. If you're going to say no to the accommodation that the person has requested, and you're not required to provide precisely the accommodation that someone requests, you should offer alternatives. So try to figure out other things that you can offer that would allow the person to access your program despite their disability-based limitation. You're going to finally want to respond to these requests in writing and always explain exactly what you've approved, or if you're denying it, explain your justification for the denial. Keep in mind that if the reasonable accommodation request is reasonable on its face, as I said, you can approve it without discussion. The process for reasonable modifications is much less in depth than what you're going to see in the employment context. So the reasonable accommodation interactive dialogue with an employee is going to be more intense because you have a more intimate relationship and a more ongoing relationship with that employee. And so one of the consequences of that is that it's going to rarely be appropriate to request medical documentation in the Title II context. Process these requests quickly because you're usually operating on a timeline. You have an event coming up, or you have someone who's waiting to receive a service. And so you want to make sure that you're responding in a timely manner. And the goal here is to provide equal and integrated access. So at the end of the day, your goal as a public agency is not to deny reasonable modification requests. It's to figure out a solution to make your programs maximally accessible to people with disabilities. So we're going to go through some examples, and I'll be quick so we can get time for questions. So one first example is a member of the public wants to bring her service animal to a meeting with her social worker. You want first to determine whether the animal is in fact a service animal. There are two questions that you're allowed to ask. Is this service animal needed because of a disability? And what disability related task is it trained to perform? The answers to those two questions are going to tell you whether you have to admit the service animal. You probably will if it is indeed a service animal that's trained to perform a task for the person with a disability. And then, you can consider whether that animal's presence would pose a direct threat. So if the animal is not under control, if it's aggressive, if it's biting, if it's not house trained, you can ask the animal to leave.
This is the sign language interpreter. Can you hold on just a second so that I can go back to the second point to determine the, yeah, thank you. A little bit quick.
All right, so you want to think about whether the animal's presence would pose a direct threat, whether the animal is under control, and whether there's some other safety risk to having the animal there beyond an allergy or a phobia. So, a service animal wouldn't necessarily be allowed in an operating room because that might be a safety risk because it needs to be a sterile environment, but other parts of this facility would need to allow the service animal. We do have a training, a very in-depth training on service animals coming up on June 7th. So definitely check that out. You can register on our website. Another example that we see a lot is that somebody asked to attend a public hearing remotely. I think it's getting harder and harder to say that these are not reasonable requests on their face, as agencies are set up more to provide remote access. So you're going to need to think about what the disability-based need is and really determine that this is in fact a request for a reasonable modification based on someone's disability-based need. But then you're going to just have to think about what the logistics are that are necessary to allow remote access. And we're happy to problem solve with you here at MOD. Often you can be pretty creative about providing Zoom access or Teams access, other sort of remote platform access to those kinds of meetings. Another example would be a member of the public can't use an agency's online application form because it's not accessible. Check to see if you guys have a mitigation plan you've developed, if there's a quick fix to the accessibility issue, and consider whether there's another way for a person to apply for that service without using the online application form. That might mean a member of the staff filling out the application online for the person with a disability, although that should really be a last resort, and we should let people, make our forms accessible so that people can fill out their own forms in the first instance. Another example is a member of the public only wants to talk to a certain staff person. Again, you want to make sure that this is actually a reasonable modification request. This is actually because of a disability-based need. You're going to think about whether that granting that request would fundamentally alter how the agency operates, and whether the request is workable for the agency or whether it would sort of unduly administratively burden the agency because it would upset staffing schedules, staffing availability. But it's going to have to be considered on a case-by-case basis. This one is really easy. A member of the public asked for slides of a presentation to be provided in advance. Usually this is going to be totally feasible. You've got your slides prepped, you've made sure that they're accessible by using PowerPoint's accessibility checker. And this should be one that you probably don't need to have a conversation for. You can just make sure that you're providing those in advance. You might just need to ask the person how far in advance they need it and agree on a reasonable time frame. So we've only got a couple minutes left. Here are the resources. I'm going to send this slide deck out to all of you, so you'll have these links. We've got kind of basic Title II links, program access links, physical access links, web accessibility links. I will let you guys peruse those on your own, and I will open it up to questions. And as always, you can contact us if you have more questions, and we're here to help guide you through this Title II process. So any questions before we say goodbye? Feel free to raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. We've got a question from Sue Wonderly.
Hey, Julia, great presentation, thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the accessibility lead for digital accessibility at Mass DOT. One of the things that we've been looking at is that the DOJ has issued a notice, sorry, what do they call it? A notice of rulemaking around Title II, which I believe means they're going to reevaluate and probably come out with some stronger guidance. So I just was wondering if MOD has any thoughts on that, any anticipated changes that you've identified. Thanks.
I haven't seen the NPRM yet, the notice of proposed rulemaking. I mean, they said that they've announced their intention, but I haven't seen the actual notice yet. So it's as of yesterday, it wasn't available. It hasn't been published. I know it's been sent for review. So we're just kind of waiting. It was sent for review in March, so it's May. So maybe we'll see it soon. We're keeping our eyes peeled. I don't have any inside information about what they are planning though.
Thanks.
Any other questions? That's a good question though. And it's good for everyone here to know that there might be some changes. I've got a question in the chat from Daryl Jenkins. Do accessibility requirements consider websites used on mobile devices? Are there requirements for that? Yes, absolutely there are. So you do need to consider the accessibility of your web-based products on both desktop and mobile devices. And the WCAG guidelines, which are the guidelines that the standards that we use here in the executive branch, do have requirements around accessibility on mobile devices. So you can get those by going to W3C, their website, or you can go to our web accessibility policy, which is on EOTS's website, and that links over to the standards that we use here in the Commonwealth, and that'll have the requirements for mobile devices, or the mobile view of your web products. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us here about a specific product. And Sue just put the standards in the chat. So thank you for that, Sue. Any other questions? All right, it is 2:02, so I will let you go. If you have a question after the fact, feel free to reach out. Either, oh, we have one question from Alexis. Do service animals and emotional support animals have the same reasonable accommodation requirements? Not in the Title II context. And this question will be addressed on June 7th at our quarterly tea. So I'm going to say no, Title II only covers service animals. And to find out more, come to our quarterly tea. You can register on our website and you will get really good in-depth information about the requirements around service animals. All right, last call for questions. Give it a minute, then I will sign off. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. Feel free to reach out if you have questions, and good luck creating accessible public programs. And thank you for showing up today.